Good morning.
Good morning.
It's past 9 o'clock. Let's get going because Fred wants to get out of here. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Committee on Affordability, Accounting, and Planning meeting. Please be advised this meeting is being broadcast over the internet and is being recorded. Agenda item number 2 is consideration of approval of the minutes from the June 20th, 2018 committee meeting. Is there any questions? Is there any further discussions on that?
Move for approval.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Agenda item number 3 is consideration approval of consent calendar. This consent calendar includes non-controversial items that can be approved without comments or discussion. This allows to save time for other items that need more attention. The consent items are highlighted in gray on the agenda. The following is on the consent calendar for consideration. Agenda item 5E. Are there any agenda items that anyone wants to move or remove from the consent calendar? Any question? Anybody? I have a motion and a second, please.
Make a motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor, say aye. The motion passes. Agenda item number 4 is public testimony on agenda items relating to the Committee on Affordability and Accounting and Planning. We do not have any registered to testify, so we'll move on to the next item. Agenda item 5A is consideration of adopting a staff recommendation to the committee relating to the 5-year review of Higher Education Fund HEF allocation. Dr. Julie Eklund, Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding, will provide a brief presentation. Dr. Julie Eklund and Mr. Thomas Keaton, Director of Funding, will be available for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anwar, and good morning, committee members. Coordinating board staff are charged by statute with reviewing the 10-year Higher Education Fund, or HEF allocations, some call it HEF, at the 5-year point. The allocations were developed in 2015, and in order to provide recommendations for reallocation, the timeline for review falls now. It's pretty much at the 3.5-year point. And that's because any proposed recommendations need to be prepared for consideration by the during the 2019 legislative session. So first I'll provide a little bit of background. There are 2 types of funds that are constitutionally authorized for public higher education. The Permanent University Fund, or PUF, is a large endowment that's available to the Texas A&M and UT systems, with the UT System Board of Regents having responsibility for controlling those funds. The income from the PUF is referenced to as the Available University Fund, or AUF. No more than 7% of the assets may be distributed in a given year, and 2/3 are slotted for the UT system, with the rest going to the A&M system. Not all schools in the 2 systems are eligible, so we have provided a list of qualifying institutions. The PUF and the HEF provide funding for several purposes as outlined in the Texas Constitution, including new construction and excellence enhancements. These funds are appropriated separately in the General Appropriations Act and not directly appropriated to the institutions. Institutions may use a portion of these funds for payment of debt service on bonds issued for authorized purposes. Income from the PUF may also be used for support and maintenance programs at certain institutions. Okay, so now we'll focus on the Higher Education Fund for the remainder of the presentation. The Higher Education Fund, or HEF, provides $394 million per year for capital expenditures. There's a 2% set aside for technical colleges, and the rest of the funds are allocated to eligible institutions based on 3 factors. Here you'll see a list of the HEF-eligible institutions, and note that it does include some A&M institutions. These institutions are included due to their participation in the HEF prior to coming under control of the A&M system. The coordinating board is required to involve institutional stakeholders in the 5-year review process for the HEF. We invited participation of all eligible institutions through a nomination process. The appointed work group met in August with additional back and forth via email. The group made recommendations, which I'll share in a moment. It's important to remember that the amount allocated remains constant at the $394 million per year through the end of the 10-year cycle, and of course that end is 2025. So this recommendation is strictly for allocation purposes. The work group recommended keeping the same methodology as what was used for the allocation in 2015. 50% for institutional complexity, and that's based on all funds formula appropriations, 25% for space deficit, which is based on unadjusted space it's based on the unadjusted space deficit using the space projection model, and 25% for the facilities condition, which is based on the campus condition index values for building inventories. What is different is the years of data that are input into this methodology in terms of the recommendation. So this slide shows what is currently used for data inputs, that's the middle column, followed by what is proposed for input for the remainder of the years through 2025, for the last 5 years. The committee recommends using actual 2018-2019 biennial funds for the institutional complexity component and fall 2017 data inputs for the space deficit and campus condition index. So you can see that the years there are updated in terms of the data that's being input. On an earlier slide, I noted that the majority of schools supported this proposal. The only area of real difference related to whether to use the adjusted or unadjusted inputs for the space model. Put simply, this was whether to adjust for buildings still under construction or only use existing completed buildings. The eligible institutions sent preferences to a short survey, and then the response was 2-to-1 for use of the unadjusted model. So that is what's in the proposal. Finally, staff is required in the applicable statute to look at the HEF impact on deferred maintenance and facilities improvement, which is a common and important use of HEF funds. Staff found that increases in HEF levels corresponded to an improvement in conditions and that deferred maintenance levels are manageable. So thank you very much, and I've asked Mr. Keaton to join us, and we would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Any questions?
Mr. Chairman. Okay, so the deferred maintenance, I mean, obviously, these funds can be used for that. You know, HVAC repair, you know, heating, you know, all just basic, you know, renovation, not renovation, but just maintenance of the building.
That's correct. They can be used for renovation of the buildings or for, you know, subsystem maintenance, mitigation of deferred maintenance, critical deferred maintenance. And the only restriction in that area is it has to be used for education and general facilities, what we refer to as E&G, or the building systems in so much as they support E&G. Now that gets a little wordy, but it's more easily explained with an example. In this building, if the first floor was E&G, but the second and third floor were non-E&G, you could still replace the roof, attributing a third of the total cost to the proportional share of the building that this supports.
So a football stadium probably wouldn't be.
We've had that question come up several times. There are in several of the football stadiums a minor amount of the space that is used for education and general purposes, and it's reported that way in the inventory. Those inventories are audited, and in that case, whatever that proportional amount of the entire football stadium, if it's 1%, then 1% of the cost of that stadium could potentially come from HEF funds.
So on the available university fund for UT system and A&M system, that can also be used for maintenance?
I'm not really the authority on that, but when you look at the Constitution, those two texts are almost verbatim.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
But it is pro rata, right? They can't replace the whole roof with half, only the percentage that the educational.
Whatever the proportional share of that, you know, whatever the space, if there's 1,000 square feet in the building, 500 are E&G, 500 or not, half of the cost of the roof in this case, or other building subsystems that you can't isolate, can be used.
Yeah. So that's correct.
Now, you can't go to an E&G part and then use that. So if there's a series of rooms that are all non-E&G, And you can't use HEF on that and say, well, I can use 10% because it's 10% of the building. It's the thing in so much as it supports the E&G endeavor. That was the text. That's the text in the Constitution.
Is there any further discussion? I need a motion and a second, please. All in favor says aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Agenda item 5B is data highlight, the changing pipeline to completion. Dr. Julie Eklund, Assistant Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding, and Dr. Heggie, Deputy Assistant Commissioner, will provide presentation and will be available to answer any question. This item is for information only.
Thank you very much. I will begin the presentation, and then Dr. Colleen Hagee will pick it up halfway through. I think there's kind of a logical split. What I'm going to be talking about is the 60 by 30 educated population goal and the completion goal, and how these two goals fit together. We were inspired to tackle this topic earlier this summer after we began to hear some questions raised about whether Texas is really on track to meet the 60 by 30 educated population goal, or whether it was even possible by 2030. Well, it's an ambitious goal, but it certainly is possible with a lot of effort and with, of course, changes in the business as usual mindset. And so let me talk you through these two goals and sort of the key things to understand about how they are calculated. So first, the goals are interrelated but distinct. The completion goal, as does the marketable skills and student get goal, support the overarching 60 by 30 goal, which is our educated population goal. And you can see why folks might get confused. Many of the state and many members of this board know well the results of our 8th grade cohort analysis. In the most recent year, 22% of 8th graders from Texas public schools went on to complete a higher education credential within an expected time frame of 11 years to complete high school and college. So that's starting in 8th grade, 5 years to go through high school, and then 6 years to complete college. So one might ask, well, if only 22% of those students in the 8th grade cohort complete, how could the current attainment levels in the state be 42.5%, which is where we are now? You might ask, how will we get to 60% by 2030 with those numbers? Well, one reason is the 8th grade cohort rates are lower than the current attainment. One reason the 8th grade cohort rates are lower than the current attainment rate is that the 8th grade cohort is not representative of all the ways Texans ultimately complete and earn a credential. The 8th grade cohort analysis is a good way to examine students who come from public K-12 schools, head right into higher education, and complete college in a relatively efficient way. That's in those 11 years overall. These are completers who take a straightforward path through their education. However, there are many paths that Texas residents take through high school and higher ed. I have several examples on the slide. For example, residents who migrate to Texas, either for higher education or after they earn a credential. Residents who don't graduate from a public high school but attend a private school or earn a GED or are homeschooled. Residents who delay entry into college or stop out. We know we have a large stop out population. Stop out during college and come back later. We have several folks who take longer than 6 years after high school graduation to complete a degree or certificate. The size of that non-traditional population is surprisingly large, so meaning that population who doesn't go directly from high school into college, the population that we don't find in our 8th grade cohort. Here we examine all of the 2017 undergraduate completers and find that those captured by the 8th grade cohort analysis represent just 36% of the total. 24% of 2017 completers who were public Texas high school grads took more than 6 years to complete college because they progressed slowly, or perhaps they were a part-time student, or perhaps they started late. 26% were Texas residents but wouldn't be captured in the 8th grade cohort analysis because they didn't attend public schools here, or they began in public schools after 8th grade. 5% and 9% of the students come to college from out of state and out of country, respectively. Regardless of the path students follow, they will be counted toward the completion goal if they complete college in Texas. And they will be counted in the attainment goal if they are 25 to 34, live here, and have a credential from anywhere. So we took this information and we decided it would be important to break it out by age, and I think we've shared some of this briefly with you at earlier meetings. But these are the same data for the 2017 completions that we just looked at on the pie chart, but it's broken out by age groups. And you can see most of our completers are 22 to 24 years old, but 45% of the completers that we track are 25 years old or older. So we have a very large proportion, almost half of our completers, who are beyond that age group that would fall into, for example, the 8th grade cohort or a traditional 6-year trajectory for a public high school grad. Now, this is a graph that we created while we were working on the plan. And it is intended to illustrate how the completion goal and the educated population goal work together. As you can see, we will rely most heavily on completions from our Texas institutions to reach our goal. If we reach our completion goal of 550,000 certificates, associates, bachelors, and masters in 2030, higher ed institutions in the state will have credentialed 2.4 million residents in that 25 to 34 age group in 2030. We anticipate that another approximately 250,000 educated residents in this age group will come to Texas from other places. In the most recent attainment increase, 1.3 percentage points the most recent attainment increase was 1.3 percentage points, and completion increased 3.9%. And I know we shared that with you. This is actually what we need to do each year to reach our goals for these measures. To give you a sense of how ambitious these improvements are, I'll provide a little historical context. When we examined the decade prior to the 60 by 30 text plan and averaged the annual growth and attainment for the last 5 years, the rate was 1.1 percentage points. We need 1.3 percentage points for each year of the plan. Now, we've seen that growth in some of the years past. In fact, we saw it just this past year. But it's going to be a stretch, but certainly not impossible. And this is the data that we shared with the committee. The growth needed to reach the completion goal, 3.9% per year, is within the range that we saw during the closing the gaps. But again, it's on the upper end, and we need to be ambitious to get there. We've always said, well, we're going to look at the plan as we move through and make any adjustments needed based on interim analysis. And I just wanted to take a minute to point out that there's several plan characteristics that have applied to our approach to long-term planning, not only for this plan, but also for closing the gaps. And that's that there should be a few clear and ambitious goals, and that targets are set under each goal to focus attention on areas that are critical for reaching the goals. That the plan should be a living plan and be evaluated in intervals to ensure that the plan reflects trends and changes over time, and that institutions and regions should have local and regional control because they vary and best understand the improvements and initiatives that are best suited to their context. So this review of data that we just went through suggests that the 60 by 30 educated population goal is feasible, but it certainly won't be easy. Business as usual won't get us there. Collaboration across higher education, business and industry, and K-12 education is critical. The state will need to retain graduates from Texas institutions of higher ed, as well as attract graduates from other states. The strength of the Texas economy is critical. Economic development, job growth in 21st century industries, and competitive wages will be needed to attract and retain credentialed workers and to help the state meet the educated population goal. We will also need to invest in and improve pathways through K-12 schools in the state to ensure that many more students are college ready and make the leap to higher ed. But beyond that, we also need to improve the many varied pathways that we see now. Now more than ever, we understand now more than ever that they serve a great many of our completers. Thank you, and now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Colleen Hagee along with the remote for the second half of our data highlight.
Good morning, committee members. So in the next piece of this presentation, I'm going to dig in a little bit more to the completion goal that Julie just talked about and specifically focus on one of the targets under that completion goal. So we focus on African American students, Hispanic students, male students, and economically disadvantaged students and their completions. And the last of these is the one that this piece of the presentation will focus on. So with this target, we aim to increase the number of economically disadvantaged undergraduate students completing certificates, associate's degrees, and bachelor's degrees from Texas public and independent institutions of higher education to 246,000. While economic status is often correlated with other demographic factors, it's important to look independently at economic status as it cuts across gender, race, and ethnicity. For example, African American and Hispanic students are disproportionately poor in Texas, and at the same time, low-income white men have some of the lowest rates of direct high school to higher education enrollment. Today's presentation will provide an update on our progress for this target and dig into some of the questions we receive about this data. So first, I'd like to describe how we measure economic status. We track economic status based on whether a student received a Pell Grant at any time prior to graduation. So to be included in this target, a student may have received Pell for many semesters, many years, or just one. They could have received it in their first year of enrollment or any time prior to graduation. We only include undergraduate completions in this target as graduate students are not eligible for Pell Grants. So in our accountability system, we show information about Pell receipt in the current year for all enrollees by sector. So statewide, the percent of all enrolled students, undergraduate students, receiving Pell in 2016 was 33.5%, and you can see this on the graph. And if we look at all the students enrolled in 2016, not just in the current year, and check whether they received Pell at any time in the current year or previously, that percentage goes up to 43.6%. When we restrict our population of 2016 enrollees to those who are within 2 years of graduation, so our more advanced students, we find that 52.9% received Pell at some point in the current or previous years. Finally, by the time we get to graduation in our 2016-2017 year, we see that the percent of completers who ever received Pell is at 54.5%. So as you can see, as students progress through higher education, they're more likely to have received a Pell Grant at some point the longer that they remain in higher education. So now we're looking at the total number of economically disadvantaged completers since the start of the plan in 2015. So remember, these are the completers who would have received Pell any time prior to graduation that we were just looking at in that light blue bar. Now we're looking at that trend over time. So completions among economically disadvantaged undergraduates increased by 10,000 credentials in the last 2 years. And between 2015 and 2016, the percent increase was 4.5%, and between 2016 and 2017, we increased 3.9%. So while we're making progress towards this target, the current pace falls behind the 5.3% annual increase needed to hit this target in 2030. Now this graph, which comes from our 60by30text.com website, shows completions among economically disadvantaged students compared to those who are not considered economically disadvantaged based on our definition. So many are surprised to see that the annual number of economically disadvantaged undergraduates completing a certificate or degree now exceeds the number of non-economically disadvantaged students who complete at a public or independent institution. So how can this be when the graduation rates for economically disadvantaged students are lower than their more advantaged peers? And the gap between these two groups has remained fairly stable over time. So to explore this, we're going to look at the trends in completions by economic status and sector over the last 10 years. So on this graph, let me first draw your attention to the two bluish lines, which represent completions at four-year institutions. So the dark blue line is showing completions for economically disadvantaged undergraduates, and the light blue line is showing non-economically disadvantaged students. So you'll notice that when this starts in 2008, there were roughly 8,000 more completions among students who never received Pell. By 2012, those two lines cross, and this is the point at which the majority of completions at four-year institutions were awarded to students who had received Pell at some point prior to their graduation. Now examine the two red lines, which represent completions at two-year institutions, with economically disadvantaged students in the darker shade of red and non-economically disadvantaged students in the lighter shade. You can see in 2008, the dark red line for economically disadvantaged students had the lowest number of completions, but by 2017 had the highest number of completions on the whole graph here for two-year institutions or four-year. So you'll also notice that 2010 was the first year that economically disadvantaged undergraduates made up the majority of completions at two-year institutions, which is 2 years earlier than what we saw the trend at our four-year institutions. So overall, completions by economically disadvantaged students have nearly doubled over the last decade and now make up the majority of our completions. Yes, graduation rates have improved over time in both sectors and for students who are economically disadvantaged and not, but the gap in graduation rates between economically disadvantaged students and their more advantaged counterparts has remained fairly stable over time. For example, six-year rates at our universities, economically disadvantaged students, their graduation rate is around 48% relative to about 67% for their peers. So the shift that we see on the graph is primarily due to the increase in the size of the economically disadvantaged student population in Texas and the growth in the two-year sector overall, where economically disadvantaged students are represented at higher rates. Data from the TEA, which relies on indicators of free and reduced price lunch, that's how they consider economically disadvantaged student status, they indicate that poor students make up about 60% of our K-12 population, and this is a data point our commissioner cites regularly. So this presentation illustrates the importance of understanding how we define economic status in higher education for the purpose of the plan related to Pell receipt measured retrospectively at any time prior to completion. It also provides an explanation about why data show that completions for 2017 were awarded to more economically disadvantaged students than non-economically disadvantaged students. This shift is primarily driven, as I said, by the size of the economically disadvantaged student population in the state. We have not reached needed progress on this target in the first 2 years of the plan, and given the significant growth of this population, increased support for this group will be really critical to meeting our 60 by 30 text goals. One strategy for encouraging more support for poor students is the graduation bonus, one of our policy recommendations for the upcoming session. The grad bonus will reward institutions for completions at $500 per completion, with an additional $500 for completions for an at-risk student. And economic disadvantage is one of those ways that a student can be considered at risk. So finally, achieving our target of 246,000 economically disadvantaged completions has the potential to improve workforce opportunities for graduates across the state, improve the lives of Texans and their families. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, let's see. So this slide that Julie presented, the pie chart, traditional completers, more than 6 years delayed, which I understand that. This is the 8th grade. This is the thing that, you know, it's bugged me, as you know,
Yes,
is that
and that's
funnel.
what we've tried to.
The 22%. And so, in other words, how do you go from 22% of 8th grade, you know, students, you know, actually having a degree? And so part of it is the 11 years. They can do it later.
Exactly.
The other thing that just is amazing to me is that 26% are private schools. So that's only a public school cohort. Is that, am I reading that
Well,
pie
they
chart?
didn't attend public high schools in Texas. They might have attended public high schools elsewhere and come to Texas and completed. We do have students in that population. We have students who were homeschooled. So we have a,
Or a private school.
yes, you
that would
could
include
consider
private.
that.
Well, anyway,
And coming in from different places, yeah.
Okay, so in the almanac, or next version, if you guys can kind of explain, you know, how do you go from 22% to 60%? I mean, it doesn't really make sense, but you need to do it in a kind of a clear way.
Let me add one thing in terms of the 8th grade cohort as well. That only measures people that started in the 8th grade. There are students that weren't in that cohort that
Right.
may have come in the 9th grade, the 10th grade, the 11th grade. The graduates from the high school, some significant number may not have been anywhere included in that cohort because they came in to the public high schools at a later date.
And we
So
do
that-
see a big bump in 9th grade in the enrollment in public high schools.
Yeah.
Would the 9th grade cohort be a better funnel to to point out?
Let me sort of give a history. The 8th grade cohort is being used by a lot of people in a way it wasn't originally intended. It was really intended as a way to really get at the flow of students through high school. Could we find breaks in the pipeline that we needed to focus on to move forward and to give some insight into whether we were where we needed to work together with the public schools. When we first did this as a 7th grade cohort, one of the first things we found out were we had 17,000 students that started in the cohort but didn't graduate from high school, but they were enrolled in college, which meant they may have gone into a private school at that point. They may have left the state and come back. So these are all things, whenever you're trying to track students, it's reality. People have different lives.
Well, okay, so the big picture, I mean, it's really wonky, difficult stuff to understand. But in the almanac, there is this funnel that shows
Yes.
8th grade cohort and then 22%, you know, actually complete.
Yeah.
Or actually, it's something like 70% actually go to college, or 65% or something, or finish high school, and then there's a lesser percentage that go to college. Well, anyway, so people look at that and say, well, there's just no chance.
Right.
So you guys need to come up with a simple way, which is really hard in this data, to say, hey, it's achievable, but we need to do these things, and to explain that 8th grade cohort that it doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah, there are different on-ramps and off-ramps from
Yeah.
that.
Right, but try
central
to
funnel.
make it simple, because it's
Sure.
not. You know, I mean, it's just not simple at all. But try to do your best, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because we need some, if we're going to move the needle, we need some metrics. We need some way to measure where can we add benefit at the most impactful levels in order to achieve it.
That's right, and we also need to tell policymakers, hey, there is hope. I mean, because there's a number of things we've heard, like the committee, for K through 12 education. I mean, they basically said, well, there's no hope. There's to achieve the 60%, goal. They estimated, like 2045, and then they just did a straight line graph. Well, to counter that and to kind of show that there is hope, and to your point, to put resources in those areas that are needed, I think it's really important to make it clear.
And for that matter, do we have a feeling on really where along the pathway it's really breaking down? Do we have, where is it? Have we identified the area, the time frame, the age, the point in which we're really losing these kids?
I would say that the issue that I'm really concerned about in the data right now is the high school to higher education transition. So we're aiming for 65%, and over the last 3 years, we were at 54, 53, 52, and 52. So we've been moving in the wrong direction. We haven't seen big increases there, and so we're kind of missing the mark. And I think particularly I was looking recently at male students, that's really where male students are dropping off. And if we're going to hit that male completion target, we've got to get more coming into higher education.
If you look at the eighth grade cohort, how do they measure up to prior 8th grade cohorts? Are we
We're making
ahead?
progress.
We are.
I
So
think
we're not.
we were at about 18% when we first started doing this cohort, and we're at 22%. And that might not sound like much, but when you look at the actual numbers of students, it's actually it's a pretty large increase.
Right, so that is improving, even though that metrics may not be the most accurate.
And it's been continually
Like
improving.
9th grade seems like a better place to start, I agree, but
Yeah, it was,
Yeah, when was it 18%?
well, when
10 years ago.
was it?
We just did a 10-year summary, and so
Okay,
it was
so
10 years ago.
So in
10
10 years.
In 10 years, we went up.
And it hasn't been
4.
fluctuating like some data do, like our high school to college enrollment. It's been a steady
It's
increase
been a steady
throughout
increase,
that
so half a
time.
percent, half a percent, half a percent
Yeah.
or so.
The base is getting larger.
Yes,
Right.
the base is getting larger.
Percent increase is even more significant given.
Right, total numbers of successful students has gone up.
Absolutely. And I do think it's interesting, as we were talking about the economically disadvantaged students, and when we look at that population, we often see students who go part-time, who might, need jobs, might take a little longer. So those are the students who we may see leaving after high school, coming back in, graduating beyond that window that we look at in the 8th grade cohort. And so certainly wanting to understand that population too, that the patterns might look different, because we do have a lot of our students, as we said, 45% of our completers are 25 or older and would not be included in that cohort. Some of them started there, but it took them a different pathway to get through.
Yeah, one thing that I think is pretty clear, we're swimming upstream with an HB5, which is you have to opt into a college track. But this Advised Texas program seems to be working, but that's really focused on seniors, right? I mean, when does that start?
It starts from the time they enter high school.
Okay, well, anyway,
So-
if you, just a suggestion, following up with what Welcome said about what are the points, it would be nice to get resources to educate and advise 8th graders. Like, hey, this is the track. When you get into high school, opt into the college track, and then start thinking about college. I think that would anyway be helpful as a big policy matter.
statistics compare with other states?
Well, the reason we have an eighth grade cohort is that instead of a seventh grade is that the Houston Endowment wanted to compare us with other states. And the only other state that really had the data to do that was Florida, but they didn't have the seventh grade. So I think maybe one other state was involved at some point, but there just isn't this kind of data available from other states at this point. We could look to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, I think, to get some comparison, but it's different data. But there are states that clearly do better in terms of students going directly from high school to college. I know my time in the Northeast, it was clearly more common for people to continue in college in those states. We'll follow up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to say that I found these data astonishing. I had no idea that that these numbers would come out the way they did. I would have never guessed if somebody had asked me what percentage of students graduate through an alternative pathway. I would have said 40%, 45%, maybe at the most, not 64%. So we were going to have to talk about our outreach activities and talk about if we're doing them properly. I would have never guessed that such a large percentage of students graduate over the age of 25. That's really remarkable. We have to take a look at all of our outreach activities to make sure the emphasis is in the right place. The percentage of students that are homeschooled, we ought to find ways to reach out to those students, make sure they understand, because if they're not in schools, if they're not in public schools, they may not know about Texas Grant, they may not know about institutional financial aid. We have to make sure that all that information is transmitted, but these are remarkable data.
What I've seen in West Texas is that the economically disadvantaged students don't go to school very much, and when the oil and gas prices are up, there's a lot more jobs. They just go work in the oil industry and they don't go to school at all. So there has to be a way to convince them to, maybe to attend college in the evening or part-time, something like that, to achieve this 60 by 30, because we need to increase that by over 3% to achieve this goal. Am I right, Commissioner?
Yes.
Yeah, I might add in terms of the cohort that we do run that by region, so we are able to see regional differences and that you suggest. And I think one encouraging thing is that while our outreach efforts haven't been as targeted to some of these students, we are seeing large gains with this population. And so, but one of the purposes of this type of presentation with our plan is to identify ways going forward that we can pump things up, or there are the areas that we haven't focused on in the past, as the Commissioner said, that we need to focus on more going forward. So we really appreciate your feedback. And of course, if you going home tonight, if you think of any good ideas, please let us know.
It's really important for board members to appreciate the growth in the number of poor students who are graduating is really impressive. And we need to congratulate our colleges and universities for achieving that goal thus far, and urge them to do even better. But that's remarkable. So congratulations to our institutions of higher education, public institutions.
Any other discussion? So we move on to agenda item 5C is a report on facilities project that were submitted to the coordinating board. Dr. Julie Eklund, Assistant Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding, will be available to answer. This item is for information only. Any question? No question. We move on to agenda item 5D. is consideration of adopting the staff recommendation to the committee relating to the report of student financial aid in Texas higher education fiscal year 2017 General Appropriation Act, Senate Bill 1, Article 3, page 3-54, 85th Texas Legislative Regular Session. Ms. Lisa Moeller, Senior Director of Student Financial Aid Program, will present an overview and be available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Good morning. This report to the legislature pulls together an extensive amount of data to present a picture of financial aid to students attending Texas institutions. It's a resource that we refer to regularly throughout the year in answering questions to the legislature and others from legislators. In addition to summary data on types of financial aid and distribution of the aid, a profile section provides details on each major financial aid program, including how funds support students, as well as dollars dispersed and appropriation amounts. Additionally, financial aid data specific to each institution appears in an appendix. This thing to work. Okay. Oh, it's not working. Okay. Sorry about that. It's important to keep in mind that these figures are averages and that some students pay more depending on their programs of study. Although tuition has been increasing while appropriations have declined, Texas higher education remains comparatively affordable. For example, the national average undergraduate tuition and fees for students attending a public two-year institution is approximately $3,000, compared with approximately $2,000 for Texas students. This places Texas third in the country among all states in terms of least expensive community colleges. Texas places 21st in lowest cost public universities and is 30th in affordability for private universities. The chapter of the report addressing tuition and fees includes the challenges of limited tax bases that fund community colleges, costs to institutions in the form of regulatory compliance, and foregone tuition due to exemptions and waivers. Exemptions and waivers for undergraduates and graduates combined have increased 37% since FY 2013 for a total of $3.8 billion during the 5-year period. 24 of the 54 exemptions and waivers reported in FY 2017 were optional, granted at the discretion of institutions, while 30 were mandated by statute. Exemptions and waivers had the greatest impact on public universities, representing 79%, over $707 million, of all exemptions and waivers granted to students in FY 17. Hazelwood exemptions represented the largest amount of foregone institutional revenue from exemptions and waivers. The Hazelwood Act provides qualified veterans, and in some cases, spouses and their dependent children, an education benefit for up to 150 hours of tuition and mandatory fee exemption. This graphic illustrates a big difference in the distribution of aid for undergraduates compared with aid to graduate students. For graduate students, 86% of the financial aid reported in the database is in the form of loans. This is almost twice the percentage for undergraduate students. 58% of all students, undergraduate and graduate, receiving aid financed a portion of their education through student loans. More than half of the approximately $10 billion in aid awarded was in the form of loans. Breaking this down further, this slide shows that the type of institution plays a significant role as well. Of the $4.3 billion in financial aid awarded by public universities to undergraduate students, more than half of the aid was loans. On the other hand, approximately 1/3 of the $1.7 billion in financial aid awarded by public two-year institutions was in the form of loans, while almost 65% of the aid was grants. And approximately 91% of these grants were federal Pell Grants. To demonstrate the differences in Texas trends compared with national trends in terms of funding sources, we've placed these two graphics side by side. Both tables are in millions, and rather than focusing on the dollar amounts represented, I'd like to bring to your attention the order of magnitude of the funding sources. In Texas, federal grants are by far the primary source of grant funding, followed by institutional grants at a distant second. At the national level, institutional grants have actually surpassed federal funds as a primary source of grant funding. In Texas and nationally, private grants come in third place, while state grants provide the lowest amount of assistance to students. For loans, there's not a pronounced difference between Texas trends and national trends. Nationally, federal loan borrowing is trending downward, while it remains at a steady level in Texas. This slide shows how state programs compare with one another in terms of the family incomes and expected family contributions of the students they serve. Our two signature state grant programs for public institutions serve the lowest income students among all state programs. The Texas Grant Program serves students attending public universities, while the Texas Educational Opportunity Grant Program serves students attending public two-year institutions. Almost half of all Texas grant recipients and 68% of TEOG recipients had calculated expected family contributions of $0. The other state grant programs, as well as the Texas College Work-Study Program, also served a high percentage of students whose families had no money to contribute to their education costs. While the state loan programs did serve students whose families had few resources, the average expected family contribution for students receiving these loans was much higher than for students receiving grants. Despite almost $10 billion in financial aid provided in FY 2017 through federal, state, institutional, and private sources, there is still a significant shortfall between college costs and available resources. Cost of attendance includes not only tuition and fees, but also books, supplies, room, board, transportation, and other personal expenses related to education. After accounting for financial aid through grants, loans, and work-study, as well as expected family contribution based on income and assets, undergraduate students in FY 2017 still faced an average unmet need ranging from $6,500 at public four-year institutions to approximately $7,000 at public two-year institutions. And as mentioned earlier, eliminating that gap is an important part of achieving the goals of the strategic plan because it represents a significant barrier to completion. And overcoming this barrier requires more than just financial aid. It requires efforts by everyone involved: students, the state, institutions, and the business community. For example, the Commissioner has been talking about the idea that businesses can use this opportunity to provide paid internships that provide meaningful work experience for students while assisting with their education costs. While the state of Texas has a robust financial aid program to support our higher education goals, as you have heard today and a number of times, one must keep in mind that almost 60% of the students in the P through 12 pipeline come from low-income families. Therefore, expanded investment in financial aid is necessary to achieve the four goals of 60 by 30 techs.
Thank you.
And that's all I
Is
have.
there any questions?
Good morning, Ms. Mueller.
Morning.
I'm referring to page, actually the graph that's numbered number 2 on the first page. Just for my information, I'm noticing just the gap between the public four-year universities Texas average and the private four-year university institutions, and just the fact that the cost is more than 3.5 times that of a public four-year university. And that to me is astounding. Has that been going up, or does anyone in the staff maybe want to recommend? It seems like it's been going up significantly. I don't know. I just think that 3.5 times is a lot. And then just for my information, if you don't have it, but I would love to get it in another email, is just how many private institutions we have in Texas and how many public. That would be good for me to know.
Sure.
And then if you do have the number of, the escalation, because I do see a lot of Students who are being recruited into are very qualified private institutions. We have a tremendous amount that are very qualified. And I believe that at certain times they don't really understand what their scholarship, for example, might mean. It may be a full scholarship the first semester they're in, but then the next semester they run out of, let's say it's a scholastic scholarship, they run out of, instead of 20 that they gave out in the fall, they now have 10. So you've got parents that are calling saying, wait, now I have to come up with $9,000 right before we have to drop, right after the day of dropping. And so that's just another kind of scenario that I wanted to share was as we're reviewing the cost regarding private and public. So I don't have the data and I don't know the data, but I'd love to have the opportunity to review it on another separate occasion.
Okay.
Thank you.
And appendix, I believe it's Appendix C that breaks down the, it shows all of the institutions, separated public, private, 2-year, 4-year, and sure, we will get back to you on that.
Okay, so you said there's a significant gap between college cost and aid, and you said $6,500 for 4-year institutions and $7,000 for 2-year institutions. Is that per year?
Yes.
And then the difference.
That's for FY17, based on the data that, the cost of attendance for every student reported in the, I've got it, thank you, reported in the financial aid database, and the amount of aid awarded, and the expected family contribution subtracted from the cost. That's the gap.
But that does not include loans, so the difference is made up by either loans or they get a job.
That includes all aid.
Loans,
Yes.
you think are aid, so they still have this deficit.
Right. And of course, students, the cost of attendance for every student isn't going to be the same. I mean, the students have choices to make. They can, have a roommate and lower the cost of, they make up that gap in some cases by just making lifestyle choices, but for the most part, they're having to, well, as I said, they're having to really make cuts in their cost, their other costs besides the ones they have control over in terms of the tuition, that don't have control over in terms of tuition and fees.
Yeah, but it's still
big gap.
a barrier. So, all right,
It
thank you.
sure is. Definitely.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
On the slide, the federal grants are the primary source of aid in Texas. To what do you attribute? It looks like federal grants are the primary source in Texas, but if you look at nationwide, there's a big flip to institutional grants. Not that one, the one.
Right, that's a good question. That graphic was taken from the College Board. We would have to really dig down to see if all the sources of institutional grants that the College Board is using match up exactly with the institutional grants at Texas. But yes, that is noteworthy.
I guess my question would be, we ought to dig a little deeper and find out why that is, and if ours is a preferred method, or if the national model is attributes more for student success.
We can do that, definitely. Whenever we're comparing national data that is readily available with state data, there are always opportunities for, you're comparing, in some cases, it's not apples to apples 100%. So we'll definitely do that and get back to you.
I can just point out one difference that I don't know the magnitude of it, but many of the out-of-state institutions that are private charge significantly more tuition than our privates, for example, do here. And in many cases, some of those institutions provide need-based aid to 50% of their students, and much of that is local funds. But I don't know to what degree it would affect that and how these are weighted. But there are many more of those institutions, I believe, in the national data proportionally than we would have in Texas.
Thank you, David. So I would just say, we found Appendix C. And if you could, it's great data on every one of the universities, public or private, but it would be good if one of those columns just added them up, that said, we've got 40 out of this, or 50 of that, or, you know, because I see the numbers, but it would be good, just in general sense, to compare.
Okay.
That'd be
Thank you.
great. Thank you.
Yes, I wanted to tell members that we've been aware for a long time that we're disproportionately dependent on federal financial aid compared to other states. That's one of the reasons that John White and I try to go to Washington at least annually to meet with members of the Texas delegation and let them know how dependent Texas is on the Pell Grant program. I think we have a larger percentage of poor students in Texas than a lot of other states do, so that does have some impact. The other point I wanted to make is and at least I don't know what the answer to this question is. That slide on the pie charts that indicate what the levels of support are for undergraduate versus graduate students. What do those numbers mean? For example, does that mean that 85% of all graduate financial aid is in the form of loans? Does it mean that 85% of graduate students take out loans? What exactly does that?
80% of the aid is in the form of loans.
Okay, 80% of the aid, okay.
Right.
And does that include teaching assistantships? Is that considered aid? Or is that
don't
just
believe so.
considered employment?
I think that's considered employment.
Well, those numbers are significant because 2 points. When we look at proposals for graduate programs, particularly doctoral programs, we always look at the financial aid that's available. And we want to make sure that there is fellowship money, there are teaching assistantships to help students make their way through school. You shouldn't have to take a vow of poverty to get a PhD. We also want to encourage institutions to aggressively raise money for graduate fellowships. One of the reasons that Texas is not as competitive as we would like in the rankings of our institutions, particularly at the graduate level, is that Texas has relatively low levels of financial aid for graduate students. And I'm talking about grants or teaching assistantships, research assistantships, any kind of grant or employment rather than loan. I'd also be interested if we could break down the percentages between professional schools and academic programs.
Okay.
Any other questions? If there's no other questions, I'd like to have a motion and a second, please.
I move for approval.
I need a second.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion 5D is passed. We move on to 5E, is on the consent calendar. Agenda item 5F is an update of Emergency Aid Network EANet activities. Ms. Monique Lee Whitley, Project Coordination of the EANet, and Dr. Mary E. Smith, Assistant Deputy Commissioner for Planning and Policy, will present an update on the EANet activities and be available for question. This item is for information only. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you, Chair Anwar and members of the committee. This morning, Emergency Aid Network Coordinator Monique Lee Whitley and I are pleased to provide you an overview of the Emergency Aid in Texas project. As you're aware, and you just heard at some length from Dr. Cullinan Heggie, socioeconomic status is the biggest predictor of educational attainment. It's not ethnicity, it's not race, it's family income. Surveys show that financial stress weighs heavily on many of our students, and unforeseen expenses, even those that are less than $300, may be enough to actually derail a student's college career. Even a dead battery can seem like a catastrophic expense for a student and the family. So emergency aid can be critical to help a student stay in his or her courses and not stop out or drop out altogether. The purpose of emergency aid programs is to direct small amounts of money to students who are struggling to pay for a financial emergency. The programs are often administered through offices outside of financial aid, such as the Dean of Students Office, Student Affairs, and one-stop shop departments, or through a foundation that supports the institution. But wherever they may be housed, emergency aid programs are designed to support students in meeting unexpected financial needs and help them stay on the path to graduation. Common forms of aid include emergency loans and grants, campus vouchers, food pantries, and completion scholarships. An example of a one-stop shop emergency aid program is the ARC, which is a part of Amarillo College's No Excuses Poverty Initiative that the board recognized for excellence back in April of last year. To help move Texas toward meeting the goals of 60 by 30 Tex, our state is primed for understanding more about emergency aid programs, particularly the impact that they may have on student persistence and completion. The idea of the Emergency Aid in Texas project has been to identify and then to disseminate strategies, best practices, and approaches in emergency aid programs, and to spotlight the successes of exemplar programs here in Texas. The project began back in November of 2016 with grant support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The project has had 4 phases. In Phase 1, the coordinating board sent the Emergency Aid in Texas survey to 178 2- and 4-year public and private colleges and universities in Texas. The survey leveraged national data on emergency aid by NASPA, the Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education, and it was designed to help provide us a deeper understanding of emergency aid practices at higher education institutions in our state. The response rate to the Emergency Aid in Texas survey was 80%, thanks to our colleges and universities' interest, and thanks to the diligent attention that was paid to encouraging survey responses by Monique here. Results of the survey informed the selection of the Emergency Aid Network members and the topics of interest for their meetings. Based on the survey's results and ensuring a diversity of representation across our state by sector and system and by location, we invited 10 Texas public higher education institutions with significant underrepresented populations of minority students and existing emergency aid programs to participate in the EANet. All invited institutions accepted the invitation, and as you can see here on this map, there's a diverse membership of institutions in the EANet. Institutions' teams were chosen by their presidents, and they represented departments such as Student Affairs, Financial Aid, and others. The first meeting of the EANet was held 15 months ago, in June of 2017. Members were charged with identifying strategies and best practices that help promote processes for effective emergency aid programs. And now Ms. Monique Lee Whitley, the coordinator and lead facilitator of the EANet, is going to provide you an update of the EANet's activities since that first meeting.
Well, thank you, Dr. Smith. And as you can see from these pictures, there's the EANet hard at work during some of our meetings. Since their first meeting, the 42 active team members of the EANet have been meeting bi-monthly, either in person or virtually, and operating both as a learning community and as an advocacy group. During their 8 meetings over the last 14 months, members have been learning from one another's experience and research and from state and national experts in the field of emergency aid. Experts like Tim Rennick of Georgia State University, Sarah Goldrick-Rab of Temple University, and the Wisconsin Hope Lab, and members and representatives from Trellis Company. In order to further study necessary program components, the EANet was subdivided into subgroups here, which you can see on this slide: best practices and community partnerships. And as you can see on this next slide, During Phase 3, the awareness and dissemination phase, the EANet has made presentations to various stakeholder groups. And on September 10th through the 11th, the EANet held the Advocating for Emergency Aid Programs in Higher Education statewide convening. All institutions, nonprofit organizations, and philanthropists statewide were invited to attend. Our records show that about 230 people were in attendance at the convening. Day 1 was more of a briefing for higher education leaders, and Day 2 was designed for the administrators and others who have a hands-on role in creating, enhancing, or managing the day-to-day operation of emergency aid programs. The convening provided insights about how emergency aid programs can assist Texas students as they persist through and complete their programs, and how programs can be enhanced to align with design principles for exemplary programs. Convening participants learned about best practices and community partnerships from keynote speakers and EANet presenters. They reviewed a draft report of information and recommendations and were encouraged to offer input and feedback on both the draft and also what they heard from presenters at the convening. Heather Marsh, the executive director of the Texas Higher Education Foundation, informed participants about the opportunity to apply for many grants to support Texas colleges and universities that are developing or enhancing emergency aid programs at their institutions. It is our hope that through future collaborations and through these many grant awards, institutions will develop solid foundations for their emergency aid programs. And finally, in Phase 4, advocacy. We anticipate that the members of the EANet and other interested stakeholders will continue to champion these best practices presented at the convening. We'll also be finalizing the report and sending it to the Gates Foundation as well as to the members of the coordinating board, and we'll be making it available to all colleges and universities in Texas, our state's executive and legislative leadership, and to our national audience. So what have we learned? Well, for number 1, as you can see on the list there, it's important to define emergency with consideration for flexibility on criteria and eligibility. There's lots of rules surrounding financial aid, but emergency aid is not financial aid, and even disaster aid has its own set of rules. So this is why it's very critical that institutions define emergency according to their own needs and resources, and also to move on to next steps. For number 2, institutions should develop an EA program manual and train both staff and faculty on processes to ensure consistency of program policies and procedures. They should also collect and store data for tracking, evaluation, funding, and sustainability. So for number 3, advertise widely. Diversify the outreach to students using phone, text, email, social media, or etc. For number 4, housing, transportation, and childcare were the most common needs reported. So institutions should consider partnering with federal, state, and local public entities, as well as private industry. For instance, Health and Human Services, or HUD, for like housing and mental health, and maybe CAAP Metro and local food banks for transportation and food insecurity issues. We also learned that co-location of social services on campuses can help students better access the services they need. Regional partnerships with wraparound service providers would be ideal. Number 5, use automated technology whenever and wherever appropriate and doable. Besides lessening administrative burden for staff, many students are too embarrassed to walk in to receive the needed services, especially our male students. So online applications and mobile apps really help to break down these barriers. Artificial intelligence like chatbot technology can be used for tracking, distribution, and outreach to students in the format that they are most used to. Institutions should always combine touch with tech, which brings us to number 6, creating a culture of caring. Institutions can combine technology with touch by using apps for the first mode of contact and for early alerts, but to retain the human touch through caring staff, faculty, and student mentors to cultivate a campus culture that says, we care about our students' needs. And I think these statements say it all. It's about the love for students and that social, emotional connection. I'm truly excited that the finalized report will be used statewide and nationally to provide advice and recommendations regarding the development, implementation, and evaluation of emergency aid programs. This report will be particularly helpful to us here in Texas as we move forward to meet the goals of 60 by 30 Tex. We thank you for allowing us to present today, and we'd like to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions, please? Go ahead.
Yeah, a couple on my part. To be clear again, is this is a program that's already in place?
At several institutions, yes.
And sort of how much aid has been provided in the last maybe 2017? Any idea?
Well, most institutions, these are small dollar amounts, right? So your average award is usually around $300.
No expectation of repayment?
Some of them have emergency aid loan programs. Some of them have grant programs that, where the student doesn't have to pay it back. But any type of aid in these situations where a student wasn't able to plan for this event will help. Obviously, grants, things that they don't have to pay back would be better, but, emergency loans are, better than a sharp stick in the eye.
The current source of the funds?
What's that?
Current source of the funds?
Most of them are external. Alumni giving, crowdsourced
Philanthropy,
funding.
then?
Yes.
So a follow-up to Mr. Plank's question. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that you mentioned, does it come straight to the coordinating board?
Came through the foundation.
Through the foundation, right. And then we disseminate that to the participating institutions that have this type of program. Is
The
that
10
correct?
institutions that participated on the EANet all received a grant from those funds.
Okay.
And then, of course, we used funds to administer the EANet and the convening and everything. The many grants that were mentioned at the convening by our executive director of the foundation will be to provide, to be offered to institutions that are trying to start or enhance their programs currently. And that's our hope, is that they'll apply for these mini grants and start a program. I can tell you that 30% of the affected institutions during Harvey did not have a program, but many of them do today. And very quickly, they were able to gear up. We did a webinar last August to help institutions deal with the money, disperse the money from the Harvey Help campaign. And so they were able to use some of that to help their students.
What is the source of the funds for the mini grants, I think is what you're asking?
It originally came from the the Gates grant that was set aside for these mini grants. The source of those funds were from the Gates Foundation.
Great, thank you. And thank you, David. On my last thought is just, when you were talking about technology and the fact that, we just often don't know what Mother Nature is going to do and when and where, would there be some thought that maybe we at the coordinating board, and this is just a recommendation, I wouldn't say that we need to do it here, or it has to be tweaked, but some kind of a GoFundMe that is just for the coordinating board so that businesses would know, our partner businesses would know that they can funnel the money up to you, and through EANet, it could be distributed to the universities that really need it. It's just a thought, but when you talked about technology, it's hard for everyone to have one of those, especially when you're in crisis, but maybe just some kind of way that the coordinating board could play a role in an electronic technology manner to always be able to have these funds available and challenge businesses to help. I'm sure there are many businesses who would like to have a place that you can put it.
There are. I would love to see something like that earmarked through the foundation or something. That's a great idea. I would love that.
Just to be ready, because we don't ever know.
Yes.
Any other question? Go ahead.
Is there some movement at the state to provide emergency aid funds? Did I dream that, or has there been some discussion?
I'm not aware of any statewide, either Monique or Mary, are you aware of anything at the state level?
No, but I mean, just the idea of having an emergency aid program, that is a strategy to help low-income students. There are institutions like Texas A&M University that have put forth $30 million to be used over the next 10 years. And then there's also other states, Massachusetts and Minnesota they now have state grants specifically for emergency aid programs.
One of the things that this is a symptom of is the increasing number of poor students who are going to college, which is a good thing. But we're having to adjust to their particular circumstances and needs. For example, there was a survey that was done a few months ago that pointed out that nationally, poor students oftentimes miss at least one meal a week. They just can't afford to eat. It's not uncommon that poor students go one day, you know, in a given interval, a week or 2 weeks, one day a week without eating. And one of the things that's been happening at our campuses is more and more campuses now have not only these emergency aid programs, but they have food pantries where they collect canned foods or other kinds of food to provide to needy students. More colleges and universities now have closets so that students can go borrow a suit or appropriate business attire to go for a job interview. And these are the things that institutions are now having to do to keep their students in school. So we're going to see more of this sort of thing, and I think it's very important that institutions are stepping up.
Yeah, I mean, by providing these, what I call wraparound services, like the food pantries, the clothing closets, somewhere where you can send your students to help get eyeglasses, you know, so that they can see to go to their classes. They can now use those funds that they were going to have to use on groceries or whatever to buy that book, right? These students are forced to make a choice between, you know, buying a book or paying for a class or taking their kid to the emergency room or things like that. So by providing these services and making these partnerships with agencies that provide these services, then that sort of lets the student, you know, better budget those funds, if you will.
Yeah, I do know that in the food insecurity area, that's the one variable that you can do without. You have to pay your rent, you have to do other things, and a lot of people forego that. So it seems to me that food insecurity, although you wouldn't assume that that's the case, it may be a bigger factor than we think. And maybe there's an idea to come up to reach out to all the local food banks.
Yes.
And get them to coordinate with the local universities in their area and maybe cooperate in that service.
Right. I've had institutions call me and say, how, you know, we want to start somewhere. What's the easiest way? And the easiest way is a food bank, right? Whether you have one on your campus or you just reach out to your local community food bank that maybe has a mobile pantry. And that mobile pantry bus can come out twice a week or whatever and help support your students. So that's the easiest and sometimes first step. You know, take baby steps and take it from there. But yeah, food pantry, making these partnerships with apartments even in your local area. You know, set aside a certain percentage of them for short-term leases for students that, you know, maybe lost their apartment due to flooding or fire, things like that.
Any other questions? What's the limit on this emergency aid? Is there a limit you put on this, or?
Well, most institutions have a yearly amount that a student can apply for, and it's very low. It's usually under $1,500. Most of the time, about $300. It just depends on the resources available for each institution, so it's going to be different. But again, we're talking low, small amounts, and usually just one time a year. These, like I said, these are things that cannot be planned. You know, even something as small as a dead battery. I had a dead battery yesterday. It was $107 to replace it, you know. So,
You said they can only ask for one time a year, or can
yeah,
they?
Most of them do. Some institutions, like Amarillo, they're more about just stopping the bleeding, so they don't put a limit on it. But you know, it just depends again on the resources that the institution has. They are lucky enough to have a $60,000 a year endowment, and hopefully most institutions can work towards that. But some institutions that are just gearing up, you know, we're hoping that these mini grants can be used to start those types of operations, but, it's just depending on the resources available. Texas A&M Kingsville, they completely revamped their program after joining the EANet. They had a small program, and it was very well run, but they have just gone all out through crowdsourcing campaigns, fundraising at football games. They, donate so much per touchdown for their team. It's just all the inventive ideas to raise these funds are just amazing. So we've learned a lot.
I like to say Vice Chair Arcelia has a great idea that, you should approach all the businesses for this EA fund so that, I think so most businesses will be very, very receptive to give any kind of financial aid for emergency.
I think they're willing to, too. They want to participate. I mean, and it also, it's about creating that culture of caring, right? It's not just in the school, it's in the community.
Yeah.
And so it's a win-win for both sides.
And did I hear correct? You can send your old clothes to them they can use. Is that correct?
Where all your suits and dresses, yes, you can. Each institution, hey, everybody's seen you on TV now in that suit. You can't wear it again, so you might as well donate it.
The reason I'm asking because I've been told to get rid of my clothes. So,
there you go.
About
So
30%
all those
of
suits,
them.
yes, all those suits and ties, they would be put to good use. We have these students that, they're scraping by, right? And so buying a new suit or buying, any suit is hard. So.
Anyway.
So I would just have one last quick comment. Maybe at the upcoming conference, I know we have so much great stuff we're going to talk about, but maybe that's a point that we really just focus, since we're going to have everyone in the room, and talk about just how do their emergency aid projects look, and just to continue to bring light of that effort.
And
and
really
there will be
important.
businesses there as well. So
Yes,
thank
and
you.
leadership from the top down. That's what it's about, It's where it starts sometimes, and you have to get campus buy-in from the top down.
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
being here.
Thank you very much.
I guess next item is adjournment. Following the adjournment, we will take a brief 5-minute break to allow the staff to set up for the cause academic workforce success committee. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
All says aye. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
So,
It's a good idea. Yeah.
do you think it might work for UT?
Seems like if we could produce
The touchdown?
small.
That's a